story of struggle and triumph. It's now 50 years since People's Republic of China regained its seat in the United Nations. Join me to find out how.
From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello there and a very warm welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan. As one of the United Nations Security Council's 5 permanent members, China has been playing a key role in solving crises around the world. This year, 2021, marks the 50th anniversary of the restoration of the People's Republic of China's seat in the United Nations. That represented a major diplomatic victory through struggle by China, by many third world countries and others.
Is as follows: in favor 76, opposed 35, abstention 17. The draft resolution adopted.
October 25th, 1971, the People's Republic of China restored its seat in the United Nations. The Resolution 2758, sponsored by Albania, Algeria, and another 21 countries, was passed with overwhelming majority in the 26th United Nations General Assembly. There were cheers, applause, and dances in the hall. A delegate from Tanzania even performed an African victory jig in the front row.
After that, we went back to the office and we were all happy. Yeah. So those who celebrated in the assembly, it's for all of us, of the delegation of Tanzania, but other countries too, a lot of them.
But the 22-year struggle since 1949 was not without challenges. Throughout the 1960s, the United States employed procedural maneuvers to make China's representation an quote-unquote important question. A question that only a 2/3 majority vote could decide. By then, China's diplomatic influence was very limited. Only a few socialist countries chose to recognize the People's Republic. It seemed that the PRC got no chance to be recognized by the United Nations. But as more colonized countries in the Third World declared their independence from imperialist powers, China seized the opportunity to build friendships with Asian and African nations. More friends, more support, and more votes. The 2/3 majority threshold was finally met. The United States was not precisely happy with the result.
I think if this happens, they can well move their headquarters to Peking or Moscow and get them out of this country.
But the UN headquarters is still in New York City, and the world welcomed China in 1971.
Of the General Assembly, I take great pleasure in welcoming the delegation of the People's Republic of China.
Since then, China has been trying to honor the principles of the UN Charter and played a significant part in the solutions of the global affairs.
At this new historical starting point, China will continue to make all-out efforts in participating in UN affairs, safeguard the status of the UN. We will uphold the banner of true multilateralism.
In December 2018, China's share of the UN peacekeeping budget for 2019 through 2021 was raised from 10% to 15%, making it the second largest funding contributor only after the United States. China has also dispatched the most peacekeepers among permanent members in the UN Security Council, with more than 40,000 blue helmets fighting for peace in over 30 missions. Now, for more on this, we're joined in our Beijing studio by Professor Fu Jun. He is a professor in Peking University. And also, we're joined in Glasgow, UK. We have Hannah Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined, and also former head of policy and partnerships in the United Nations Development Program. China, welcome to both of you. Dean Fu, Professor Fu, let me start with you. We know that the Communist Party of China defeated the nationalist KMT government and became the de facto and de jure government of China in 1949. But it took 21 years, not until 1971, did the United Nations recognize that the CPC governed China. Why that long?
Well, it's a long story. It takes a whole course to unravel the story here. But, well, After the Civil War, the CPC-led China CPC won the victory over the KMT regime. But then, from the perspective of the United States, actually they were waiting. They were, from what I read from historical books, there are signs they were ready, getting ready, if that's the word to use, to shift aside. Then the word Dean Acheson, if my memory does not fail, was saying, let the dust settle.
Who said that?
Dean Acheson,
Uh-huh.
the Secretary of the United States, was saying, okay, let's wait and let the dust settle. When we declared the founding of the People's Republic of China, there are parts of China which we continue, the People's Liberation Army need to continue to liberate those areas. So he was saying, let the dust settle. So there are signs that the United States was waiting and to see the final result of the Civil War. But then, unfortunately, the Korean War broke out between North Korea and South Korea, and subsequently, the United States was involved, the UN forces was involved, and the Chinese volunteer army was involved. Then there are other consequences following that. So it's a complicated story there.
But eventually,
21
years later,
in 1971, if I remember correctly, due to a UN General Assembly resolution, the number is 2578 resolution, if I remember that correctly, where we have votes with we overwhelming majority votes in favor of us. 76 yes, 35 no, 17 abstentions. So this is overwhelming votes in favor of us replacing Taipei. Beijing to replace Taipei as the sole legitimate government representing China. So that was the story.
But before this resolution for Beijing to replace Taipei, there have been, efforts to help China regain its seat as early as the 1960s, right? There have been many Albania and Algeria-backed resolutions. All of them were voted down by U.S., Israel, and their allies.
Yes, as I was indicating, it was a process, after the Civil War, after a very bloody Korean War, then the Vietnam War, there has been a process sort of I want to use the word to regain, is to replace Taipei with Beijing as the sole legitimate government representing China. China has always been a member of the UN system from the founding of that system.
1945?
Yes. But then there is a shift of the ruling government, and that need to be solved.
You're talking about a change of government. Hannah, let me go to you. A change of government is not unheard of, right? If you look at history around the world, sometimes the change of government came with bloodshed, revolutions, civil wars, which was the case in China from 1945 until 1949. In some cases, the change of government came through democratic elections. But all in all, why did it take the United Nations so long to recognize the CPC-led government as the de facto and de jure government of China?
Well, the UN is obviously a complex institution. It is, as we know, in the General Assembly, it's one country, one vote. And of course, at the time that China was trying to regain its seat, there were also a number of other issues taking place. If you look to the continent of Africa, for instance, there were so many African countries who were also making their own fight for independence, self-determination, coming out of colonialism. In 1945, there were just 3 African countries that joined the UN, and over time, by 1971, there were around 40 or so African countries who were then members of the UN, having come out of that process. So there were many different priorities for the UN, of course, many countries to pay attention to, a lot of formation and issues. Nevertheless, by 1971, as you say, there was it was then eventually agreed that China would be, the People's Republic of China would be the one member in the Security Council and also General Assembly. And many African countries certainly backed that up. There were 26 African countries of those that had got their self-determination, who were then able to vote positively for China to do that.
Well, Hannah, you talk about the fact that since its inception in 1945, there have been only a couple independent African states that were recognized by the United Nations. But with the independence movement and with the end of Western colonialism, there have been an increasing number of states recognized by the UN. Over the decades, how do you look at the growth, the increasing impact of the global South in the United Nations system?
Well, there have been so many different ways in which the global South, I guess we would call it, the majority of the United Nations member states have really tried to assert their views. First of all, by the way in which the General Assembly works. Of course, we have the UN one country, one vote. There are also different alignments. For example, the G77 plus China, which exists, and also there's also a number of different groups. The non-aligned movement, for instance, which just celebrated its own birthday, as it were. And then there are a number of other types of groupings, regional groupings, the Africa group, and also other regional groupings as well. So these are ways in which different member states can come together to try to form different views, propose different ways of trying to take forward multilateralism in the true spirit of multilateralism, to try and come together to make the most challenging decisions for our world. That said, it isn't easy. Even when you do have coalitions that go across different regions, where you do have different members of the Security Council involved, whether it's China, the UK, US, or others, it's still, it is obviously, and as we've seen with COVID-19, very, very difficult to make progress. Nevertheless, it's much needed, and I think we can discuss that a bit more as to why it's needed.
Sure, we'll do that soon. I want to, focus on China for the moment, Professor Fu. When China, the PRC government was not recognized during those 21 years, there had been a two-state solution proposed by I think Saudi Arabia and the United States, saying that there can be a PRC China and a ROC China, but those proposals were shot down by both Taipei and Beijing because both parties adhered to the one China policy. What does that tell the international community about cross-strait relations?
I guess a more compelling document to look at is the Shanghai Communique signed between Washington and Beijing when we approaching rapprochement between the two countries. And in the Shanghai Communique, you read, now let me sort of read that in English, not in the Chinese version. United States acknowledges people on either side of the Taiwan Strait hold there is one China. That was finessed, I gather, by Dr. Kissinger. So that was a very strong signal that well, the word is people on either side of Taiwan Strait, they hold there is one China. So yes, that's the masterpiece. That is a deep reflection of the reality.
The masterpiece of strategic ambiguity.
No, it's well, there it's clear. People on either side of the Taiwan Strait hold there is one China.
But the first communique was not precisely clear. If you compare the first
in terms
versus the two
if you in terms of the fact that there is one China and the people on either side of Taiwan Strait, they hold there is one China.
True.
So it's one China,
But Professor Fu, it gets clearer with the later communiques.
Okay.
Right. We'll hear more about that from a deputy Chinese foreign minister at the United Nations in the 1970s later on for my pick. But for the moment, let's talk about China's role in the United Nations. It has been A remarkable 50 years. China played a key role. Here are some figures I want to share with our audience. China's support for the United Nations has been growing. It is now the second largest contributor to the United Nations regular budget, and is the country with the largest number of peacekeeping troops on standby, exceeding those of the rest of the 5 permanent members combined. Hannah, what can we learn from these figures, and what do they say about China's increasing role?
Well, I think what's most important to realize about these figures is the importance of China and other countries taking the UN seriously. The UN is there not just to provide this peacekeeping role and to help in terms of peace and security. There are a number of other aspects that the UN delivers, including, for example, delivers on issues around health, economic development, the kinds of assessed contribution that you mentioned at the beginning. China, the second largest contribution. This is a contribution which is related to China's economy. It's an assessed contribution for every single member state has to make a contribution to the UN. China's is largest because its economy has grown so significantly. And that means, and by making sure that China is contributing, China is obviously demonstrating that it takes that contribution seriously. In addition, you also mentioned peacekeeping. Now, yes, China is the largest contributor in terms of the Security Council. We must remember that there are other UN member states who are not members of the Security Council who also contribute troops very significantly as well. Again, in line with their role in the UN, again taking it seriously. But it does, of course, mark China out within the Security Council for that kind of contribution, and it makes a great difference to developing countries who continue to face conflict, in particular because of poverty and the cycles of poverty, being unable to come out of them. Hopefully, through the UN and with the support of the UN, China and other countries can help them to escape that kind of conflict.
Professor Fu, some Western media claim that China is trying to remake the UN according to China's own image and according to China's own geopolitical ambitions. How do you look at those assertions?
Well, as I would tell my students, when you look at a large forest, there are all sorts of birds, some of which are really extreme, Take these as opinions. And in English, you have opinions, you have another word which is related to opinion, very opinionated. I would treat these as opinions or propositions that are yet to be validated by empirical facts, Even when you look at the presidency of some of the UN-related organizations, there are 15. We have just 4. But if you look at staff members, China actually is well underrepresented. We need to work harder to send more people to work in those organizations. While UN system is not just for security, it's sort of the bottom line. But the UN system on the brighter side is to promote peace and the prosperity. And there China has contributing very significantly. If you look at the economic side of prosperity, China has been promoting, well, if you want me to give you a number, 1/3 of the growth, of the world economy for the past many years. So it's so important. And now we know we want not just growth, but also green growth. And you look at the Chinese record in terms of climate change, China has promised to peak CO2 emission before 2030 and to accomplish carbon neutrality by 2060. Even though it's 10 years later, but given the stage of development of China, this is quite a heck of a promise. And it's a tall order for China to accomplish that.
It is a tall order, and let's see what will happen. It's certainly ambitious. One last question for both of you, Hannah and Professor Fu, about the United Nations. We've heard this all the time, saying that the United Nations doesn't have teeth because it doesn't precisely have an enforcement mechanism. Of course, there has been this Security Council sanctions, resolutions, but there are no troops owned by the United Nations, for example. And even the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, himself admitted that the UN lacks enforcement powers. Listen to this.
The problem of the UN is that our multilateralism has no teeth. The UN has no power. We totally depend on the consensus of member states. So we put pressure, we ask governments to take measures, we bring governments together to act. We act with industry, but it all depends on the will of governments, and especially on the will of the most powerful governments in the world.
Hannah, how can we solve that problem, that the United States is considered in such a light that it has no teeth?
The UN, as I mentioned earlier, it's a complex organization, and any student of international law or international relations will tell you, this is the fundamental challenge. It is the enforcement mechanism behind the UN is not its strength. At the same time, I think we need to recognize that what is the UN's strength is its ability to call on the different views and perspectives of different member states. The one country, one vote aspect of it is incredibly important. We cannot just subsume that when we're talking about the UN and multilateralism. But clearly there is a big change, a big shift happening within the UN. A realization that multilateralism needs to work in a different kind of way, calls for different types of UN reform, whether it's Security Council reform, whether it is even reform of the voting within the General Assembly. Many people, including myself, have called for different ways of reforming the UN. But what I do think is useful, and I think coming back also to the point that you were making earlier, is an increasing recognition of the diversity and the use of diverse perspectives within the UN to formulate UN policy and to lead UN policy. At the African continent, for instance, we believe it's helpful to have Africans at the helm of different UN organizations. We believe that there will be more of an African perspective and understanding of our different challenges and issues. And like Professor Zheng was saying, then from the Chinese perspective, of course, then an understanding of what China has gone through and the support and the types of policies that China has put through can also be shared with other countries through the UN. These things are positive. These are things that many African countries and others can also welcome. The diversity of the UN can be a strength, and I hope that will only continue, both in terms of reform of the General Assembly and also of the Security Council as well.
Professor Fu, how can we make sure that the United Nations is not just the continuation of power politics?
Well, I wouldn't characterize the international system of the United States. It's just a platform for power politics. The United States, United Nations, to me, sits on the tension between realism on one side and idealism on the other. And it also reflects the tensions, and hopefully it can reduce those tensions as mankind continue to move forward. Now, if you just look at one side, this is an ugly recipe. Now, the idealism, probably you are to utopia. A more utopian version was offered in the wake of the First World War, but it did not work. So after the Second World War, what I see is a better balance between realism and idealism. And the United Nations continue to reflect the tensions. Now, the ugly reality is that the basic unit of the international system is nation states. For a sovereign domestic a country, you have a sovereign power, one central government. But when you look at the world as a small village, you do not have a central government. And if you want to have an idealistic recipe for that problem, Einstein has that. He was arguing eventually we need to have a world government. Immanuel Kant has that recipe, but these are lofty ideals, and all countries should learn and to learn from each other and working towards those goals so that we have a perpetual peace and prosperities.
Yeah,
it takes time, you know.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Fu. I think sometimes we need to be a bit unrealistic so that we can overcome the barriers called reality. Thank you very much, Hannah Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined, and also Professor Fu Jun with Peking University. You've been watching The Hub with me, Wang Guan. You'll be right back after the break. Welcome back. For today's pick, let's rewind. I want to show you a speech delivered by then Chinese Vice Foreign Minister, in fact, Qiao Guanhua, at the United Nations General Assembly floor. That was back on November 15th, 1971, shortly after China regained its seat at the United Nations.
On behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, I hereby reiterate that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China's territory, and the U.S. armed invasion and occupation of China's Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits cannot in the least alter the sovereignty of the People's Republic of China over Taiwan. That all the armed forces of the United States definitely should be withdrawn from Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits, and that we are firmly opposed to any design to separate Taiwan from the motherland. The Chinese people are determined to liberate Taiwan, and no force on earth can stop us from doing so. Mr. President and fellow representatives, the Chinese people who suffered for a long time from imperialist aggression and oppression have consistently opposed the imperialist policies of aggression and war and supported all the oppressed peoples and nations in their just struggles to win freedom and liberation, oppose foreign interference, and become masters of their own destiny.
And that would do it for this edition of The Hub. If you have any suggestions, comments about today's pick or our show, feel free to get in touch on Facebook, Twitter, Weibo, and more. Send us your social media content too, because we might just pick them next time around. Thank you for joining us. I'm Wang Guan. Our news coverage continues at CGTN. Bye for now.